So, Matt, I'm not sure how long it's been since last we met online here, but here we are once again. I said to you a minute ago, sometimes it's best just to jump into these things. So I'm at work right now in my little closet here, and I wasn't expecting for us to meet online. So this little experiment, haven't had a chance to shave it off yet. So
Well, we're the
I
beard
apologize.
brigade today, so that's it's all good. At least there's some consistency in our appearance. So
That's right. Yeah. So no, we just thought we'd talk briefly about kind of where we've been and where we see ourselves going over the next phase. It's yeah, generally about a week and a half, every 2 weeks. I think we do these things. Are not precisely scheduled, but sometimes it's pretty shocking what happens in a reasonably short period of time, right?
that's it. Yeah, these developments are coming fast and furious, Greg, and I tend to think that it's baked into the pie in that it precludes people from really organizing much of a resistance to some of the things that are outside of what we normally would, consider our democracy. So where do you start when everything's changing every second day, third day?
Yeah, well, the most obvious one, and we've talked about it already, is the terminations that were rolled out primarily by some of the bigger airlines. And again, as I said before, we've seen this happen over the past 5 or 6 months. So we don't want to ignore or minimize anybody who was terminated, as early as last fall. They've been grappling with this for a longer period of time than some of the rest of us. But what is surprising, or maybe not surprising, is the fact that when you've got companies that are as large as WestJet or Air Canada that are doing what they're doing, to have nothing really in the legacy media is, again, like I said, surprising slash unsurprising, because it doesn't really fit the broader narrative, right? Things seem to be crumbling globally as far as that narrative goes, and to have this happening is quite surprising.
And some might argue that, there's enough going on in the world that we're just being glossed over. But if you sort of think back to how things were pre-2020, to hear that 100 or more pilots were being fired from their airline jobs, and it could have been lawyers or engineers just as easily, but to see them being terminated for nothing that they did wrong, for something that just amounted to a policy change that wasn't even covered by their original contracts, that would be front page news, I would argue. So it is conspicuous to see that kind of thing missing.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I guess one of the other big things that we keep pushing is these imminent changes to the Canada Labour Code. We have seen it picked up, certainly within the freedom community, with some of the other organizations, and you and I had a chance to meet with some other groups and start to get some traction. Been on the phone again late last week with some groups as well. And what's surprising, of course, is how few of the unions were aware of it. Some of them are digging into it, but we need for the membership as a whole within Free to Fly to continue aggressively communicating with your unions, because near as we can tell from the communication that we've had, don't foresee any change from the government with this. It still could be enacted via Canada Gazette 2 really at any point, right? So
that's right. And, the rumblings that you and I are hearing from friendly sources inside the government suggest that there is quite a bit of will to see these changes happen. And
yeah.
and for those of our viewers who might have missed an episode or two, what we're referring to is changes being made to the Canada Labour Code, which will ultimately require that all federally regulated employees be continuously vaccinated against COVID-19 as a minimum. The language is quite broad, so in theory, it could even be expanded to include flu shots and perpetual boosters. So this is a big concern.
Yeah, it's the unknown with it, right? Like, I was talking with one of our members who was looking at alternate work, which is another thing that we could talk about very briefly here. But he was looking within the oil and gas industry. Somebody was offering some work within that, which is fantastic. However, unknown to most people, that is part of the federally regulated swath that this would reach. So here you go, you're with a company where you've already lost one career based on these vaccine mandates, and then you get yourself into a position where you get back to your feet and you start trucking down the road again, and lo and behold, you run up against the same wall, right? So there's the kind of the seen and the unseen within this whole situation, and some it would behoove all of our members to think through some of these things as well. A, in terms of pushing back against it, but B, also considering what route you go down, right? And I keep saying we've got to find ways to decouple from government and from big corporations, because we've seen the globalist agenda rapidly rolled out over these past few months.
And it's really not an uncommon story, as sad as it is. I'm aware of several people who have run into those exact same circumstances. It would be a critical mistake to think that these were changes that were going to be made in very small spheres of life in society. To think that these changes will be limited to just specific areas of society is a grave mistake. The walls are closing in. It's happening bit by bit, and we need to push back as though this is affecting us personally, even if it's not. So, this is that idea. First they came for the gypsies. Like this is that idea from Nazi Germany in the 1930s. It begins with one group, and it slowly expands until it encompasses all of society. So even if this isn't affecting you, this is something that will ultimately affect you, and it will certainly affect your children.
Yeah, well, and I think where you're going is where are we going, right? That's what you're talking about. The only other thing that I was going to mention from this past week, we don't need to touch on it because I'm sure anyone who's taken the time to watch this has probably seen the same thing, and it was more just cathartic to see what happened within the EU last week with leaders within that community eviscerating Justin Trudeau on public forums, which was cathartic, I would say, for those of like mind, right? And again, not much picked up. A friend of mine did say he heard about it on the radio. I don't typically watch the mainstream news, but I did ask a few people who do, and said, do you see anything? And I don't think it trended there. But it would help to impact the broader narrative when you help people to contextualize what's happening, right? Because it's a story where you go through difficult seasons in life. Let's say you go through a divorce or something, and you're really wrestling with things, and you start to lose perspective about what side is up and what side is down, because you're under so much stress. And I think on some levels, even within our own country, you become it's almost like an abusive relationship. You get beaten down for so long that after a while you start to think, well, I don't know, maybe I'm the crazy one. Maybe this is normal. And then having some leaders in other countries say, no, this is dictatorial behavior, right? Like this is tyrannical insanity, helps you to be like, wow, okay, it's not just me and some of my friends, right? So
it just adds legitimacy to sort of the position that we have taken, and people who are on the same type of fight have taken. It's never good to see somebody humiliated. You don't want to see even your own enemies humiliated. That being said, we tend to think that people like Trudeau are infallible, they're insulated, they don't receive feedback, and even if they do, they're so high and mighty that it's debatable whether it gets to them. But I'm reminded of that, I believe it was a G7 meeting where some footage was released of Justin Trudeau walking into a meeting room by himself and awkwardly looking around and not finding any friends or immediate allies he could go and speak with. And so he awkwardly leans into some existing conversations that are already in place, and he kind of gets awkwardly acknowledged, and then he awkwardly moves on to another group and eventually sits down by himself and just looks around. And this is not the body language of somebody who's infallible. So I can imagine, what it was like to sit there and have these world leaders addressing you specifically and calling out specifically the ridiculous things that are going on in your own country. Yeah. So I tend to think that this type of thing does, it hurts to hear it from his point of view, but whether it'll generate change or not, I don't know. I think there are greater forces in play in Canada than just Trudeau.
Well, yeah, I haven't seen that G7 piece. I may go looking for it. I mean, I hear what you're saying. In a puritanical, idealistic character that I should be striving for, I would agree. It's not something that we go, that we should want, but given what we've been through the past year, and I think I'll wrap up with this on the topic, I guess, but the only piece I would say is there's such a profound lack of self-awareness or even an understanding, it would seem, of the damage that's being done is I would almost suggest you do want to see this, because how else do you shake somebody out of their narcissistic fog to understand what they're doing? Because it would seem that he and those working with him don't even understand it. And I'm not convinced that what happened would make any difference, really, in terms of, I don't expect he went home and decided to change course. And I doubt we'll see that anytime soon. But I think it is important. It's the whole issue of speaking truth, and we need more and more people speaking truth, and we need leaders within our own country, within our own politicians, who are willing to unapologetically and relentlessly speak the truth. And the dearth of that over the past year, at least, is a big reason why we're at where we're at, I think. So
well said, Greg. And we're not happy to see anybody rendered uncomfortable or hurt, even if it's just in terms of their psychological, emotional space. But at this point, what I don't think we would argue that we need to see his will broken to a certain degree. I don't believe that this is his agenda. Even if his will is completely shattered, I think it's going to continue just as it has. There are players that we know and players that we don't know who are driving this agenda. And, I don't see Trudeau as being anything more than a poster boy. But it's all a victory, though. Just standing in their way, slowing them down, adding any kind of resistance in itself, in its own right, is a victory. So we do have to acknowledge it like that.
Well, and speaking of resistance, I guess I'll jump on my soapbox over the past few weeks in terms of where we're going. And I know I've bent your ear on this, so forgive me for once again ranting about it. But I've said, if you were to rank the 5 biggest things that we should be concerned about in terms of where we're going as a nation, and you and I have, we have differences of opinion a little bit with where you rank those top 10 things, 5 things, whatever. I would say in the top 3 has to be the digitization of our identity and digital currency. And I think we've got to get the public in Canada engaged on this and fighting back, because you combine digital ID with digital currency and it is the death of liberty, full stop. It doesn't matter if you're the most selfish person in the world who only cares about yourself, perhaps specifically because of that. You've now got a situation where it's completely subjective, and it can be determined what you use your own resources for. So, if you're an unhealthy person who's maybe spent too much time sitting around and you're, costing the state too much in healthcare, then certain items that you may want to purchase food-wise are no longer available to you. And it's like, wow, that's kind of extreme and crazy. And perhaps it is, but fill in the blank with any other type of scenario in terms of what your political ideas might be, or what rally you attended that maybe you shouldn't have. You look at what's happening to Randy Hill here in Ontario. I haven't dug into it deeply, so I won't go on about it, but you've got a situation where somebody who participated in rallies is now being summoned by the police because of his activities. And if we were in a scenario where his currency and all of our currency had been digitized and controlled by some central bank, we've already seen the government will to go down that road. So I think it's top of the heap in terms of what we have got to get engaged on, and there's a bit of a malaise about it because we've digitized so much of our lives. We've got these phones in our hand constantly. And so I can just tell from even with our social media metrics and that people, they're not particularly engaged with it. And I think there's a bit of a shrug factor where it's kind of like, wow, like I've got my credit cards on my phone. How is it any different? Well, how it's different is it's controlled. And when it's tied to your ID and your location and everything else, it's absolutely frightening.
Well, completely, Greg, and it's such new technology, and in historic terms, it's brand new. I mean, we're infants with this type of technology, so it presents an opportunity for the powers that be to use it in ways that work against us. I think we are at a point in our history where we are primed for and need a digital Magna Carta, and it's already long past due to articulate exactly how this technology can and cannot be used in terms of structuring society. We've already caught a glimpse of how our leaders, are using strong air quotes there, would seek to enforce their ideological platforms with how people who donated to the trucker movement were treated. Just imagine how that would have been handled had every aspect of our identity and our finances been tied into a central, the digital mainframe or digital system. I mean, it would have completely eviscerated people's lives. It almost did in our analog world. So
right.
I'm with you, Greg, big time.
Well, when you say Magna Carta, you're suggesting that we come up with almost a structured means for how to handle it, or what do you mean?
A philosophical legal platform that really articulates how this technology ought to integrate into our lives. And I would argue that it has to be complementary in the sense that it cannot really add or take away any fundamental rights that existed prior to its existence. But I do believe, given that creatures are that humans are creatures of explicit means, we generally want to have things laid out there in front of us for us to acknowledge that a system exists. And I would suggest that would take the form of some kind of a digital Magna Carta.
Yeah, well, if nothing else, for those that are still with us here watching along, take some time to start educating yourself on some of the realities of digital currency, digital ID, and otherwise, because you and your families have got to start to grapple with this. And I'm by no means an expert on it, but I've read enough to be gravely concerned about it being implemented in any way, shape, or form. So when it comes to where we're going, we've typically in our conversations wanted to be on the offense, whether it's with our employer, with our unions, etc. But as we see what's rolling out across society, I think we've also got to continue to be on the offense. We don't always want to be on our heels and be reactive. You always, when you look at court scenarios, you'd always rather be the applicant rather than the respondent, right? Because you're pushing the agenda. But I think we've got to also take some time to be defensive. And figure out what that looks like. And I think this coming summer, we've got the summer, we should have some title for it, right? Not the summer of our discontent, but the summer of our brief reprieve anyway from all of these lockdowns and these other measures. I think this is a good time to get out in the community, to get networked, to find as many people as possible that are like-minded and start having conversations about how we're going to live life when I want to be proven wrong. But going into the fall, where we find ourselves back to in a variation of where we've been over this past year, lockdown, et cetera, and all sorts of new things perhaps that we haven't seen. We've really got to get networked, get engaged, and figure out a means to, again, decouple from what we've known as, because we've all been fairly content to live comfortable lives, coupled where we can with government and taking what we can from the government and otherwise, but figure out ways to self-sustain essentially.
Well, that's a really interesting sort of platform for a thought that I've had over the last couple of weeks that I've been kind of grappling with, and that we're constantly asking people to get active. We're constantly asking people to participate in the pushback, and we're able to suggest 2 or 3 points on how that can be done. But beyond that, it's such an individual thing that it's really hard to just broadly lay out a roadmap for how somebody can get active in this pushback. But one thought that keeps coming back to me is that so much of this agenda is driven through conflict. And it's through conflict that certain unpopular developments can be almost pushed into happening, can be forced or enforced. And so one thing we can all do is seek to minimize and resolve the conflicts in our own lives. Because really, if you look around, everything that has transpired over the last 2.5 years or more, really, even pre-COVID, that are unpopular or that are undemocratic or even unlawful, those have generally come as a result of some conflict that was seeded into society, that we as a society bought into and divided ourselves through. It was a method on which to divide society. So let's analyze our own lives, look for divisions, and see if we can't resolve some of those. Because by resolving conflict and easing conflict, what we're doing is we're actually creating grounds that are much less fertile for these types of developments and for these agendas to take root. It's a small
Yeah, you
thing.
see that primarily as a means from a mental health standpoint, you mean, or just from finding other ways to connect with people, or?
Well, in both, really. What I'm getting at here is that conflict is really the landscape and the fuel that drives the agenda forward. So by resolving our own conflicts, we put ourselves on a much more stable ground. We just even metaphysically create sort of an environment that is difficult for dictatorship and for tyranny and unlawful behavior to take root. But it'll certainly impact mental health, I would argue, even first before anything else.
Yeah. Well, it's a great point. First off, I want to say it sounds like you're in a rainforest there, Matt.
Close. 100 miles south of me, maybe, but not here.
Anyway, that's a great point. I mean, even I've got some other stuff I'm working on here, and I've been thinking about the need to reach out to a few different people. And there's a couple of those relationships or people that I've got a lot of respect for, but we see the world a little bit differently in terms of the things that we're all gathered here for. And so there's been some conflict, but I said if I had a bunch of time to spend with them, I'm sure, especially once you start talking about things like digital ID and digital currency, and you can have an intellectual conversation because you've done your research, there develops, I would think, a commonality and some common ground that would help to bridge some of the things that we maybe haven't seen eye to eye on over the past number of months, right? So it's a great point to bring up, and like you said, if nothing else, it's just such a low level drain emotionally to be in conflict with people all the time. So if there's a means to find some common ground as we move forward, it's a great point too.
Oh, thanks, Greg. Sorry, I didn't mean to jump over you, but you're talking about something that maybe dovetails well into a next point, and it's really, in historic context, traditionally people have been able to leave the polity that is in conflict, and we still have that. You might battle through some things in your own community, and if it doesn't work out, you try your best. Doesn't work out, well, you have the option to leave, and we still have that option today, but it's slowly starting to leave us, in the sense that all of the nations of the world seem to be grappling with these issues in their own respects. But as it stands right now, there is a trend for people to leave Canada. And if they reach a point where they just don't see things coming back, and they could be going for any reason. They could be going for, peace. They found an area of the world that they think that they can eke out a little bit of peace and comfort and quiet, which sounds lovely right about now. In many cases, in most cases, it's people are able to port their careers to a new country or a new society, and often in many cases will be paid even better than they were in their home country. So, Greg, do you see this as sort of a process that stands to put pressure on the powers that be these days?
I think so, but it's like this pendulum that swings back and forth, even within our own industry. I think of my time with the military, they were always one great big giant swing behind the hiring boom at the airlines, right? So they would suddenly 2 years later come up with some sort of a pay incentive to keep military pilots in, just as the airlines were starting to lay off again, right? It would swing back and forth. So the way I see it, and I know you and I have talked about it, and we've put some things out on our social media as well. It's infuriating for me to watch, just as a citizen of this country, because it's the nature of things like meritocracy and otherwise, that what you want is the best and the brightest to help make your society as strong and sustainable as possible. But this government seems bent on destroying this country, and one of the less obvious pieces that's starting to happen is that we are losing highly trained, highly skilled, whether it's tradesmen, professionals, and otherwise principled people. And this is perhaps the most dire part that's happening now. I think the bulk of these are people who are genuinely committed to freedom, but they have great concern for their families. And they're saying, I can't bear to hang around anymore. I'm a fighter, but my 3, 4, and 5-year-old children, I can't bear to see them left in a nation that's turning to the authoritarian bent that we're seeing. So it's eventually, perhaps, once the cost starts to be seen, you look at our healthcare industry, you look at the shortage of doctors. I'm talking to doctors right now that are looking aggressively south of the border because, for all the reasons I just said, right? So I think it may eventually have some impact in terms of policy, but I think it'll be a ways down the road once we start to see shortages.
There's a term that I haven't really heard bantered around for the last 20 years, but it's brain drain. And I wouldn't be surprised if we start throwing that term around or hear it being thrown around a little bit more. You know, in the 90s, when the brain drain issue was at the forefront of people's minds, there was a counterpoint which was quite compelling, which was brain gain, in that, you know, those who are leaving can be easily replaced by new arrivals to Canada. And I think some attempts were made to see that happen. But there are real tangible blocks to that being a sure thing. For example, you know, a doctor from Pakistan can't just, to my knowledge anyway, come over to Canada and just begin practicing medicine. I understand that there's quite a bit of credential transfer that needs to be done, and rightfully so. You know, one of the things more close to home, Greg, is that Canadian pilots are quite unique in the world. There's only one other country in the world, and that's Russia, which has as vast of a landmass as Canada's. And so Canada as a society has historically relied on aviation for connecting communities that don't have road access. And with this reality, you know, has come a system for essentially ensuring meritocracy among all of the pilots who are working on gaining experience before they go to the airline. So the result of this is that by the time, you know, a pilot is at a point where they can do an interview at a company like Air Canada, they've acquired several thousand hours of flying experience, much of which is in the Rocky Mountains or out in the blistering gale force winds of the Maritimes or up in the Arctic. And these are pilots who are extremely robust in their capabilities and their experience, even before they start at a company like Air Canada. You know, you take a handful of countries around the world, and you'll find that most of them, to become an airline pilot, requires having the correct family connections, you know, some kind of political sway or being part of the right group. And so there's this nepotistic component of it. And on top of that, these pilots, their first job is flying an airliner, and it's in a very curated environment where they rarely get to fly themselves. By the time they themselves are captains, their flight experience is somewhat, I wouldn't say marginal, but compared to that which Canadian pilots have, it's a completely different set of skills. So these are not, Canadian pilots leaving for other countries is not something that we can really afford in the Canadian aviation industry. We cannot replace Canadian pilots with international pilots and expect to have the same level of safety.
Well, especially with the demographics being what they are, right? And we're talking about our own niche here, I guess, but I'm sure it's similar in other professions where just straight up the demographic bubble, right? You're seeing retirements that are vastly outstripping the ability to replace people. And in some of these industries, because we've deteriorated the wages and working conditions, to use our buzzword, you're not seeing the same numbers of new hires starting to show up, right? So you look at the pilot profession, for instance, in the States, the shortages down there are rather dire in some places. So yeah, this brain drain, as you say, is something that we should all be concerned about as well. And I don't fault anybody who's leaving. Everybody has a different story, a different family makeup, and we've each got to do what we need to do. But we continue to. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to provide a little bit of illustration for our viewers. There was a poll recently done with one of the in one of the chat forums for one of the major Canadian airlines, and they had 10% of their entire pilot workforce respond to this poll. The question was simply, if the USA was to open up aviation to Canadians such that they could port their careers down to the USA, would you seriously consider going? And with 10% a little bit more than 10% of the entire workforce, pilot workforce from this company answering. They had a remarkable 58% of their pilot force say yes, that they would go. So this is hardly a scientific poll, Greg, but certainly indicative of some potential for great changes coming in our
Wow. And this was done recently, like within the last year or so, or?
This was done actually in the last several weeks. Yeah, so quite recent.
Yeah. Wow. Well, yeah, there's certainly lots on the go, and we could continue parsing it forever, as we tend to do, I guess. But yeah, we just want to encourage everybody to stay engaged. I know it starts to sound somewhat trite, but we have seen an impact over the past few months, and we've got some good stories to tell as well. Maybe I'll wrap up with that. The last time we met, we put out a call for mainly our passengers, any that might be within business, have their own businesses or be in a place to offer work for some of our out of work professionals. And it's been a fantastic week. It's been, I would say, the most fun part of Free to Fly for me is seeing these connections made and having an opportunity to speak with some really awesome, like-minded, freedom-focused business owners and business leaders that have offered work to our professionals, and then in turn to see the emails come in and people say, yeah, I would be interested in that administrative job, and to make those connections is it brings me joy, as cliched or as silly as that might sound. It's quantifiable, really great stuff to see, and it makes me proud to be associated with our passengers and with our professionals. So
I echo your sentiments 110%, Greg. This is the silver lining of the situation we find ourselves in. The connections that have been made, the friendships, the relationships, the new opportunities that have been opened up, and we're going to keep, persisting. Your word, being relentless, to be relentless. We're going to continue doing that, and eventually the totality of all of these connections and these opportunities is going to begin outweighing the drawbacks and the negativity we've seen over the last couple of years. We will win. We will be victorious.
So that's right. Yeah, and if there's any other anyone else in the business community, or even if you know of some friends or that aren't connected with Free to Fly, A, get them connected, but B, feel free to pass along any work that we can pass along to our professionals as well. So with that, we'll sign off.
Greg? Just before we go, what's the best way to find us if people want to check us out?
Good job. I don't tend to do a good job with the promotions part of it. So good. It's freetofly.ca. And if you want to email us, there's a contact link on there as well. It's actually a great question because it's not something everybody knows. We've got various social media platforms, but the best way is to go to freetofly.ca and just hit the contact, and that'll bring up a form, and you can send us an email that way. So good reminder.
Excellent, Greg. All right, everybody, thanks for joining us this week. We look forward to speaking with you again, and we'll certainly look forward to bringing you all the latest updates in Free to Fly and Freedom News. Take care, Greg.
You as well.